The start of the war 10 years ago, the lives of Syrian people have been under threat. In 2011, the situation shifted from localized protests to a full-scale war, leading to a devastating humanitarian situation that persists a decade later. Now, in the course of the 10 years, 12 million Syrians, half the pre-conflict population, have been forced to flee the conflict and leave their homes behind, often multiple times, making it the biggest displacement crisis of the century. Their plight is chronicled in the documentary No Way Out, which narrates some of their journeys into exile and the extreme violence that they have personally experienced and witnessed. Joining us to discuss the film and the situation in the country is political analyst Professor Barry Hanyane and Bori Lagrange of Doctors Without Borders. Good afternoon to you, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, dear.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having us.
Now, Professor, let's start with you. Just give us a bit of the history of how this conflict began and some of the forces involved in fueling this conflict.
Yeah, as you said in your inset in passing, this war has been going on for almost 10 years now, obviously fueled by what is popularly known as the Arab Spring, and of course reflecting on the governance culture of that country at that time. Issues of unemployment, issues of corruption being at the center. And unfortunately, this led to protests spiraling all over the country, and the narrative that some of the protests were actually sponsored by foreign powers who had interest in the country, the United States, Russia, as well as the neighboring countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, being sort of like playing a pivotal role in sponsoring the different factions at war at that time. And unfortunately, this led to an all-out war, which resulted in what we have today.
Now, Bori, in terms of the conflict, it actually has become a bit of a humanitarian crisis, in fact, a major humanitarian crisis, with millions of people being displaced. Talk to us about the role that Médecins Sans Frontières or Doctors Without Borders actually plays in that side, and how many people have lost their lives to date.
As you say, it's a massive humanitarian catastrophe, if we can use that word. I think it appropriately describes what's happening. So as you mentioned, 12 million people displaced. So that's a significant number of people. The majority of those displaced internally in the country. And as soon as new waves of conflict erupts, it has this knock-on effect, displacing people again from where they were seeking safety and shelter. So it really means that there's little respite, if any, when that happens. But also, this is a conflict where we've seen the indiscriminate attacks against healthcare centers, hospitals, any health facility almost. Just to give you a sense, in 2015, that was the year when Doctors Without Borders was able to expand to the largest extent we were able to, our assistance and support for health facilities. And that was also the year where in 94 different occasions, healthcare facilities that we were supporting had come under attack. This led to the wounding of 58 staff, the killing of 23 health staff. So that's just one organization and its staff bearing that amount of violence at that particular point. But what this does essentially is when cities are besieged, when airstrikes are this common, I think the other thing we need to mention also is that this double tap strategy had emerged also, where a health facility would be struck, and then as soon as responders reach that facility, there would be another aerial strike. Causing an immense loss of life, but also indicating to civilians and everybody else that healthcare facilities are not safe in this conflict. And that's ultimately what's led to the healthcare system in Syria falling apart, being massively destroyed, healthcare workers fleeing the country with their families as well, or being displaced themselves. Also the destruction of the infrastructure, as we know. But then also, what is then left to care for people who are sick with chronic conditions? And this is ultimately also the big tragedy of this conflict, is the absolute destruction of humanity and whatever attempts there are to preserve human life.
Now, Professor, coming back to you, just speak to us about the current people or the current groups that actually control this country. And do you think there is any end in sight? This war, I mean, has started more than 10 years ago, and it seems to persist.
Yeah. Yeah, look, it's a whole lot of groups that are involved. You have the Kurds that would want to control, but unfortunately, they've been pushed back by and large. Then, of course, let's not forget the killing of Mr. Baghdadi by the U.S. forces as part of the Islamic State movement. It also has a stake, although now being weakened to a large extent. They are a force not to be undermined at all. Then you have your interference by the superpowers. In this case, the U.S. still has the military base in the western part of the country. You also have Russian influence, which is pretty much in support of the current president, al-Assad. So in the end, you have multitude of forces there, partly sponsored by countries such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states that have an interest in Syria itself. So it's a complex picture to paint, and I don't see any possible side of the skirmish being resolved, although we need a political situation to resolve the issue. Seemingly, military interference is still there. Reports are that, of course, al-Assad himself would want to meet with Pyongyang to perhaps seek support there. And I suspect this may very well escalate the issue, and he would want to retain his power by all means.
And I just want to speak about the documentary that I mentioned in my introduction. And Bori, maybe you can actually paint the picture for us there. This documentary is called Syria, a Decade of Conflict, No Way Out. Speak to us about the message it aims to actually get across and the importance of this documentary, especially in light of the picture that the professor's painted for us, where it doesn't seem like there will be an end to this conflict because of all the political and military interference.
I think it's an excellent point, because often when we're confronted with such an intensely complicated and difficult situation like this, it's almost as if we just move on. We say, well, the war in Syria is never going to end. It's absolutely terrible. But what we forget in doing that is we don't acknowledge the human lives that are impacted by this. So the aim of the documentary is really to have a direct way to demonstrate what people's lives are like, what it's become, what their memories are, what their experiences were through these 10 years. And so it takes the shape of it's in 4 parts, and it covers 9 people's lives and experiences, where they speak from what had happened to them, to their families. And you can break it up into these 4 parts as follows. So the first section, titled Bombed, deals with what was happening in Idlib and in Homs, with airstrikes, as I mentioned, on hospitals and healthcare facilities. Then the second section, Persecuted, deals with the enclave area of East Ghouta, just outside Damascus, which was the site also of a chemical attack in 2013. But then also the violence in Raqqa through the hands of the IS is also mentioned in that part. The third part, Besieged, deals with the horrific siege tactics that were displayed in places like East Aleppo in 2016 and again in East Ghouta as well. And then the final part, Abandoned, looks at what the situation is today in northwest Syria and Idlib, where it's essentially an area where the bulk of the displaced people are now centered, and is subject to a lot of economic hardship and chronic lack of humanitarian assistance, because the context is so difficult to operate in. So the documentary really tries to capture people's own experiences, and I think some of the voices that really certainly stuck with me, that rang true. For instance, Dr. Mazan Al-Sod, he speaks about being late for work for 15 minutes, and that's actually what saved his life in the end. He was on his way to a hospital that was supported by MSF at that time, and that hospital was subject of an airstrike. Then another a retired man, Imad Yusuf, he speaks about his repeated displacement from East Ghouta first, and then later on to northwest Syria. but he still carries with him the key of his house, the Ischuta. He hopes one day to be able to return there. Now, whether his home is still going to be there, whether it's still inhabitable, that remains to be seen. And I think it's this uncertainty that people deal with on a day-to-day basis that disrupts their lives. If they're not fearing for their lives because of the violence, the prospect of a future is something that I think is almost unfathomable. We also know that many people in Syria have left Syria. Many people of Syrian origin have left Syria. They've fled to neighboring countries in an effort to try and seek safety. Many have also tried to cross the Mediterranean Sea to get to Europe. I think we were all shocked and appalled by those visuals in 2015 of Alen Kurdi, a young Syrian boy of 3 years old who had drowned and his body had washed up on a shore in Turkey. And so there are these moments that are absolutely horrific in the last 10 years that almost force us to want to look away. And what the documentary tries to do is try and humanize the stories again and to confront us with the shared humanity and also to make a specific call on us. If the war continues the way that it does, there's more impetus required to ensure that humanitarian organizations, that healthcare can be spared from this violence. Because if that's not the case, if the laws of war are not respected, what hope is there to save a life in such a horrific set of circumstances? And that's really the purpose behind the documentary, is to try and take stock of this, and also to ask some questions so that people can take action.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this afternoon. That is where we'll be leaving it. Professor Barry Hanyane, who is a political analyst, as well as Bory Lagrange from Médecins Sans Frontières, also known as Doctors Without Borders, South Africa. Now,